The fallacy of the beard, the fallacy of assuming that the existence of a continuum of possible states between two binary positions means that the said positions are not really different. It's a form of equivocation, treating the equivalent of two things that should not be treated as equivalent. The alternative name is the fallacy of gray, and it comes from an invalid inference from a good premise. The sound premise represents the argument that some complex real world decisions or events are neither black nor white, but gray. This is true under many circumstances. The invalid inference is to infer that since there are so many shades of gray, one cannot identify a dividing point between the two binary positions. When applied to the realm of expertise, this fallacy is something known as the inflation of conflict. Inflation of conflict occurs when someone claims that because two or more experts disagree on one point, no conclusion can be drawn, and the entire field or area of research is probably discredited to boot. The name comes from the heap paradox in philosophy, using a man's beard for an example. At what point does a man go from clean shaven to having a beard? If you have one hair on your face, do you have a beard? No. How about 100? How about 110? How about 111, etc.? The logical form is X is one extreme, Y is another extreme. There is no definable point between X and Y. Therefore, there is no difference between X and Y. An example, Jim, I'll never go bald. Alice, why is that? Jim, well, if I lose just one hair, will I be bald? Alice, of course not. Jim, how about two hairs? Alice, no. Jim, ergo, every time I lose a hair, the loss of that one hair will not make me bald. Therefore, I'll never go bald. Alice, super. I guess you've just discovered the cure for baldness, stupidity. Here's another example. Why does the law state that you have to be 21 years old to drink? Does it really make any difference if you're 20 years and 364 days old? That's absurd. Therefore, if a single day makes no difference, then a collection of 1,095 single days wouldn't make any difference. Therefore, changing the drinking age to 18 doesn't make any difference. Although this does appear to be typical 18-year-old thinking, it's quite a common fallacy. Just because any single step makes no apparent difference, there is a difference, and sometimes more noticeable as the number of steps increase. Richard Dawkins, one of the world's best-known and most outspoken atheists, recently provoked outrage among child protection agencies and experts after suggesting that recent child abuse scandals had been overblown. In an interview in the Times magazine, Dawkins said he was unable to condemn what he called the mild pedophilia he experienced at an English school when he was a child in the 1950s. He recalled how one of his masters pulled me on his knee and put his hand inside my shorts. He also said that other children in the school had likewise been molested by the same teacher, but concluded, I don't think he did any of us any lasting harm. He also said, I'm very conscious that you can't condemn people of an earlier era by the standards of ours, just as we don't look back on the 18th and 19th centuries and condemn people for racism in the same way as we would condemn modern persons of racism. I look back to a few decades to my childhood and I see things like caning, mild pedophilia, and can't find it in me to condemn it by the same standards as I or anyone would today. He said that the most notorious cases of pedophilia involving rape or even murder should not be bracketed with what he called just mild touching up. Well, when does just mild touching up become pedophilia? If he does it more than once, if he or she does it to several children, if there's oral sex involved? Dawkins maintains that there's no definitive line. I would argue that while we don't always know right from wrong, that doesn't mean that there isn't right from wrong. As more and more Mormons are discovering, Joseph Smith married several teenage girls, at least one as young as 14. When he was in his very late 30s, the church apologists, of course, screamed Presentism and come out with articles like the following written by Gail Boyd, entitled Mormon Polygamy, Joseph Smith's Teenage Bride, which appeared on LDS.net. She writes, Helen Mar Kimball became the plural wife of Mormon prophet Joseph Smith a few months shy of her 15th birthday. While taking a bride so young startles us in this day and age, It was not uncommon in the early 19th century. Plural marriage was practiced in about 85% of the world, but the idea was repugnant among European and American Christians. A few months shy of her 15th birthday, what bizarre phrasing. And President Nelson is a few years shy of being dead. The church apologists like to say that it was not altogether uncommon for girls as young as 14 to marry. They fail to mention that a girl of this tender age marrying a man approaching 40 is extremely uncommon, even back then. As I show in my letter to an apologist using census data I gathered from Illinois and New York in the 1840s, Smith's marriage, if we could call it that, to Helen Kimball was almost certainly the only 14, 37-year-old cohort in those two states for that entire year. It seems to me that the church is reaching for the fallacy of the beard when it repeatedly refers to Helen as being a few months shy of 15. The argument from incredulity is concluding that because you can't believe something or refuse to, it must not be true. And the argument flawed. It's related to the argument from ignorance fallacy. The logical form is person one makes a claim. Person two cannot believe the claim. Person two concludes without any reason other than he or she cannot believe it or refutes it, that the claim is false or highly improbable. Example, Carl Sagan. Yes, we really did successfully land people on the moon. Tinfoil hat guy. Yeah, right. And I suppose you also believe that Elvis is dead.
Doc, I'm from the future. I came here in a time machine that you invented. Now I need your help to get back to the year 1985. Tell me the truth, Doc. You gotta believe me.
Then tell me, future boy, who's president of the United States in 1985?
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan? The actor? Then who's vice president? Jerry Lewis?
You gotta listen to me.
I got enough practical jokes for one evening. Good night, future boy.
Clearly, Marty is making an extraordinary claim, and the doc's dismissal of Marty's claim is based on pure incredulity. It isn't until Marty provides Doc with extraordinary evidence how he came up with the flux capacitor that Doc accepts that Marty's claim might be correct. Given the nature of Marty's claim, it would be argued that Doc's dismissal of Marty's claim, altogether technically fallacious, was the more reasonable thing to do than entertain its possibility under the circumstances. Someone using the argument from incredulity might claim that since they don't see how a certain scientific theory could possibly be true, it must therefore be false. People often use the argument from incredulity in an attempt to discredit valid theories that they disagree with, or to support some unfounded pseudoscientific theory or religious belief. So it's important that we understand this fallacy. The argument from incredulity is a common apologetic tactic used by those favoring intelligent design. There's a number of variations on this theme. A popular one is the use of the typewriting monkeys. Here, the apologist suggests that believing that the universe has come to be by chance is analogous to believing that if you had an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of typewriters over an infinite period of time, they would be able to come up with the completed works of Shakespeare. There are various versions of this, but the original came from a British physicist named Frederick Hoyle. In fact, there's a logical fallacy that bears his name. According to Frederick Hoyle, the probability of cellular life arising from non-living matter, abiogenesis, was about 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. That's 1 with 40,000 zeros after it. He commented, the chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way is comparable to the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. President Russell Nelson uses another common example.
Some people erroneously think that these marvelous physical attributes happened by chance or resulted from a big bang somewhere. Ask yourself, could an explosion in a printing shop produce a dictionary? The likelihood is most remote. But if so, it could never heal its own torn pages or reproduce its own newer editions.
Could an explosion in a printing shop produce a dictionary? The likelihood is most remote. But if so, it could never heal its own torn pages or reproduce its own newer editions. I interpret Nelson as saying that the odds of the universe coming into being through a big bang somewhere, and by implication that advanced life forms occurred through evolution, are simply too great, therefore God. The obvious problem with his similitude is that it limits the being of our universe and the breadth of evolution to the interval of a single event or explosion. Astrophysicists, astronomers, and cosmologists tell us that a titanic explosion, which they've dubbed the Big Bang, occurred 13.8 billion years ago. Evolutionary biologists who have studied the origins of life on this planet since the time of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Charles Darwin suggest that life began on this planet between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago. I feel that anecdotes such as President Nelson's explosion in a print shop is not helpful, as it's based on faulty assumptions that can be too easily refuted. Nelson's cute little anecdote, and he wasn't the creator of it, got him a couple of laughs, but it's not a very thoughtful analogy. A more serious and sophisticated argument favoring intelligent design might go something like this.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist.
The universe began, scientists believe, with the sum of all energy jammed into a very tiny point, exploding with mind-boggling force, creating matter and propelling it outward to make the billions of galaxies of our universe. However, they're at a loss when it comes to explaining what caused this singularity. Likewise, there is compelling and some would say overwhelming evidence that favors natural selection as a mechanism for adaptability and improved survivability. I personally feel that transition of life as a result of evolution is not just plausible, but likely. However, science has failed to provide us with anything showing how relatively simple early forms of life arose from non-living matter. This is called abiogenesis, and like the source of the Big Bang, leaves nothing but questions. So there's still room for God. I personally believe that there was a creator responsible for both the Big Bang as well as imbuing the spark of life into the combination of enzymes and proteins and amino acids that formed the first elementary form of life. Nelson's print shop illustration suggests random action. But the Big Bang and the expansion of the universe and evolution was and is anything but random. The main tenet of evolution, for example, is natural selection, which is far from random. Traits that are beneficial for survival and reproduction or propagation are selected by evolution. Traits that increase survival odds are more likely to continue. For example, in a world where carnivores are endangered, traits such as longer legs, or a better respiratory system, or higher intelligence will give the species who fall prey to these beasts an increased chance of survival. Those organisms that have these mutations, that improve those traits, have an advantage over those that do not. Simply stated, those without those traits become dinner, but those with those traits survive and they breed, and over time those traits become magnified. And as a whole, the species gets smarter, longer leg, with better respiratory systems. Nelson's example limits the scope of creation and evolution to the time span of a single explosion. The oldest known fossils on Earth are approximately 4.5 billion years old, but some scientists have discovered chemical evidence suggesting that life may have begun even earlier, perhaps 4 billion years ago. So evolution on this planet has had a very long time in which to operate. Although mutations are found in every type of organism, the process of natural selection is very slow, but it can be speeded up, as even the most strident creationists must concede, by selective breeding. Evidence of selective breeding of dogs over a few hundred years, or the propagation of new plants to better serve man's needs, frost-resistant wheat, sweeter apples, or seedless grapes, for example. The American Kennel Club recognizes 195 breeds of dog, with 79 additional breeds working towards full recognition, says Gina DiNardo, Executive Secretary of the American Kennel Club. Remember, too, that when you hear a Mormon or other fundamentalist mock evolution as a fantastically unlikely long shot, you must time those odds by the number of times possible interactions could occur. If one rolls a single dice, the chances of it coming up 6 are 1 in 6. However, while the odds are slim, one might throw it 20 times and never have it come up 6. But if one throws the dice once per second, 24 hours a day for a full month, statistically the odds of the 6 coming up very, very close to 1 in 6 is almost certain. The chances of X happening are 1 in Y. Therefore, providing Y does not equal infinity, X is possible. If the number of occasions equals infinity, no matter how improbable X is, providing it's not impossible, it will eventually occur. Moreover, given an infinite number of chances, infinity divided by Y gives a 100% chance of X as well. Before calculating odds of a future event occurring, it has to be possible. Do the laws of physics allow, as in President Nelson's example, for the assembly of type into rows by wind pressure alone? As well, one has to know what the factors are in determining the odds. If I ask you what the odds are of rolling a dice without first telling you how many sides the dice has, you have no possible answer other than to say somewhere between 1 and infinity. A second argument might be that President Nelson's ideologically driven interpretation, which assumes that the universe arose with the goal of supporting life rather than life arising as a result of conditions in the universe being amenable to it. I don't necessarily disagree with Nelson's conclusion that God was responsible for the creation of the universe, and indeed ourselves. Rather, my concern is with the non-critical thinking leading him to that conclusion. As critical thinkers, we must avoid falling victim to this type of end justifying the means lazy thinking. Logic matters. Further, given the multiverse theory, there could be an infinite number of universes that might support life and an infinite number that might not. To put it another way, there could be an infinite number that have the fine-tuning for life and an infinite number that do not. We just happen to be on one that does. A second argument that could be made by a critic is that President Nelson's ideologically driven interpretation assumes that the universe arose with the goal of supporting life, rather than life arising as a result of the conditions of the universe being amenable to it. Further, those who accept the multiverse theory would suggest that there could be an infinite number of universes that might support life, and an infinite number that might not. To put it another way, there could be an infinite number that have the fine-tuning for life, and an infinite number that do not. We just happen to be on one that does. So in short, while I do not disagree with Nelson's conclusion that God was responsible for the creation of the universe, and indeed ourselves, my issue is with the simplistic, non-critical thinking leading him to that conclusion. As critical thinkers, we must avoid falling victim to this type of end justifying the means type of lazy thinking. Logic also matters. I've learned much from brilliant scientists such as Francis Collins and John Lennox, men of faith who provide great insight into how the Big Bang singularity, as well as the principles of evolution, are not inconsistent with intelligent design, and I'd commend those thinkers to you. The logical flaw here is that President Nelson is overlaying the straw man and the appeal to ignorance fallacies onto the creation of life question, and the efficacy of evolution, concluding that life on Earth must be a result of intelligent design. His reasoning could be expressed this way: organic life requires 4,000 enzymes, which is true. It's impossible for 4,000 enzymes to form by random chance. This is a straw man, random chance. Therefore, life on Earth was created by God. This is the appeal to ignorance. Granted, Russell Nelson is not an intellectual, but presumably he is, or at least was, a man of science. Perhaps he's hoping that the explosion in the print shop analogy will be vivid enough to distract his listeners from thinking more deeply about the efficacy of the theory of evolution and the creation of the universe question. He is overlaying straw man and appeal to ignorance fallacies onto the creation of life question, concluding that life on Earth must be a result of intelligent design. His conclusion may be correct, but his reasoning certainly is not. President Nelson's a priori argument would be clearly rejected by the vast majority of biologists from an evolutionary standpoint. Every serious biological science, even I would hazard a guess, those at BYU, would proffer that other mechanisms formed as precursors prior to organic life becoming self-replicating and resulting in the incredible diversity of life we witness on our planet today. The process that underlies biology in general and human life specifically are much more complex than the most difficult and perplexing challenges in chemistry or physics that we see today. While the odds of a sudden construction of higher life forms are unquestionably remote and improbable, remember that evolution proceeds in many smaller changes, each driven by natural selection rather than by serendipity, and over a very, very long period of time. Resorting to logical fallacies, whether deliberately or unwittingly, is not a good way to investigate the natural world. The floating of such a superficial analogy by someone intelligent enough to understand the flaws that I've just described and discussed is regrettable. Brother Nelson and the Church can do better.